Dr. Clara Whitmore had left behind everything she had ever known, her career in Boston, the comfort of her family, and the respect she had worked so hard to earn to become the only doctor in the rugged frontier town of Red Creek, where loneliness, danger, and whispered warnings greeted her instead of gratitude. But just days after arriving, she made a decision that shocked everyone. She chose to treat the most feared gunslinger in the territory, a man the townspeople insisted was a cold-blooded killer who deserved a bullet, not a doctor. They laughed at her, called her naive, and warned that trusting Elias Kane would be the biggest mistake of her life. Then, while treating one of his old wounds, Clara noticed something hidden beneath his weathered coat. A worn U.S. Marshal's badge that someone like Elias should never have possessed. And the truth behind that single piece of metal would change everything she believed about the man the entire town feared. But before I reveal why the most notorious gunslinger in the West carried a lawman's badge, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I love seeing how far these stories travel. If it's morning in your part of the world, I hope you have a wonderful day filled with peace and good fortune. And if you enjoy emotional Western stories about redemption, hidden truths, and unforgettable characters, leave a comment below, subscribe to the channel, and join me for the incredible journey of Dr. Clara Whitmore and the man everyone thought they already knew. The stagecoach rolled into Red Creek just as the sun dipped behind the distant Rockies, bathing the dusty mining town in a warm orange glow that did little to soften its rough edges. Dr. Clara Whitmore looked out the window, taking in weathered storefronts, hitching posts crowded with tired horses, and miners slowly making their way toward the saloon after another long day. It was nothing like Boston. The polished streets, brick buildings, and crowded hospitals she had known all her life seemed impossibly far away. She tightened her grip on the leather doctor's bag resting beside her. Everything she owned now fit inside 2 trunks strapped to the back of the coach. When the driver finally stopped in front of the small medical office, Clara stepped onto the dusty street and inhaled deeply. The air smelled of pine, horses, and coal smoke. Before she could gather her belongings, an elderly man wearing wire-rimmed spectacles walked down the wooden boardwalk with a welcoming smile. "Dr. Whitmore?" he asked. "I am," he extended his hand, "Samuel Reed. I suppose I'm your predecessor now." Clara smiled as they shook hands. "Thank you for waiting for me." "I've been waiting several weeks," Samuel admitted with a chuckle. "This town has needed another doctor for quite some time." Together they carried her bags inside the modest clinic. It was smaller than she expected, consisting of a waiting room, a treatment room, a dispensary lined with carefully labeled bottles, and a tiny bedroom in the back. Though simple, everything was clean and neatly arranged. Samuel noticed her looking around. "It isn't much," he said, "but it'll serve the people well." Clara nodded. "That's all I could ask." As Samuel showed her where supplies were stored, several townspeople wandered past the open doorway, pretending not to stare at the young woman unpacking medical instruments. Some offered polite greetings. Those simply tipped their hats before continuing on. It did not take long for the whispers to begin. Later that evening, Clara crossed the street to the boarding house where Martha Doyle prepared supper for several guests. Martha greeted her warmly enough, but curiosity quickly replaced hospitality. "You're really planning to stay?" Martha asked while pouring coffee. "That's why I came." Martha exchanged a glance with another woman before lowering her voice. "Then there's someone you ought to know about." Clara smiled politely. "Every town seems to have someone. Not like this one." Martha leaned closer. "His name's Elias Kane." The room grew noticeably quieter. Even the men playing cards nearby stopped talking for a moment. Martha continued in a careful whisper. "Most dangerous gunslinger you'll ever hear about. Folks say he's killed more men than anyone can count." Clara listened without interrupting. "If you ever see him," Martha added, "you stay away. Don't ask questions, don't get involved." One of the miners nodded firmly. "Smartest advice you'll get around here." Clara thanked them for their concern but said nothing more. During medical school, her father had often reminded her that fear spread faster than facts. Before his death, he had repeated the same lesson whenever stories about notorious people filled the newspapers. "A doctor's duty," he would say, "is to treat the person in front of them, not the rumors walking behind them." The words returned to her now, as clearly as if he were standing beside her. After supper, she returned to the clinic, where Samuel was finishing a final inventory before leaving the practice in her hands. He handed her several account books, patient records, and a ring of old brass keys. "Most everything you'll need is here," he said. Clara carefully stacked the files on the desk until one thin folder caught her attention. Unlike the others, it contained no medical invoices attached to the front. Only a single handwritten name appeared on the cover: Elias Kane. Clara looked up. "I thought you said people stayed away from him." Samuel hesitated just long enough for her to notice. "Most do." "Then why does he have a patient file?" For a brief moment, the older doctor's expression became unreadable. He gently took the folder from her hands before placing it beneath the others. "Some questions," he said quietly, "are better answered after you've had time to know this town." Clara considered asking again, but decided against it. Samuel had welcomed her with kindness, and she sensed he was choosing his silence carefully rather than avoiding the subject. After finishing the last of the paperwork, he collected his hat and paused at the doorway. "Red Creek is full of good people," he said. "Just remember that things aren't always exactly as they appear." Before Clara could ask what he meant, Samuel tipped his hat and disappeared into the fading evening light. Alone for the first time, Clara unpacked the final instruments into their cabinets, lit an oil lamp, and settled behind the desk that now belonged to her. Outside, the town gradually quieted as businesses closed for the night. She opened the appointment ledger, hoping to become familiar with her new patients. But her eyes drifted once more toward the stack of records where the thin folder bearing Elias Kane's name remained hidden. She wondered why an experienced physician would keep medical notes on the man everyone feared while refusing to explain them. The question lingered in her mind long after she extinguished the lamp. Then, just as she was preparing to sleep, 3 firm knocks echoed through the clinic door. Clara froze for only a moment before reaching for the oil lamp and walking toward the front door. It was well past dark, and she had expected her first night in Red Creek to end quietly. Another firm knock echoed through the clinic. She unlocked the door and pulled it open. A tall man stood on the porch with the brim of his weathered hat casting a shadow over his face. Resting against his shoulder was a frightened boy no older than 12, his shirt soaked with blood around one shoulder. Clara's attention went immediately to the child. "Bring him inside," she said without hesitation. The stranger stepped into the clinic without a word and gently lowered the boy onto the examination table. Only then did Clara notice the revolver resting low on the man's hip and the worn leather gun belt crossing his waist. She looked up and finally saw his face in the lamplight. Calm gray eyes met hers for only an instant before returning to the injured boy. "The bullet passed through," the man said quietly. "He lost blood, but he's been awake the whole ride." Clara nodded as she opened her medical bag. "What's his name?" "Tommy." The boy winced as she carefully cut away the torn fabric around the wound. "You'll be all right," Clara assured him. "This will hurt for a little while, but I'll take care of you." Tommy gave a weak nod. Clara cleaned the wound with steady hands, checking carefully for fragments before preparing her instruments. The bullet had entered cleanly through the upper shoulder and exited without striking bone. It was painful, but survivable, if infection could be prevented. As she worked, she noticed dried blood staining the stranger's sleeve as well. "You're hurt too," she said without looking up. "Later. You need treatment. The boy first." There was no hesitation in his answer. Clara glanced toward him briefly. He stood perfectly still beside the table despite the obvious pain in his own arm. Whatever injury he carried, he refused to let it distract from Tommy's care. Nearly an hour passed before Clara tied the final bandage into place. Tommy had drifted into an exhausted sleep after receiving medicine for the pain. Clara covered him with a blanket before turning toward the stranger. "Now it's your turn." He shook his head once. "No. You're bleeding. I've had worse." Clara folded her arms. "You carried an injured child through the night to find a doctor. You obviously believe in medical care." A faint hint of amusement crossed the man's face. "For him. And for you." He looked at the floor for a moment before pulling his sleeve back just enough to reveal a long scrape across his forearm where a bullet had grazed him. Clara cleaned the wound quickly. It was shallow and required only fresh bandaging. Throughout the treatment, he remained silent, never complaining or even flinching. When she finished, he stood and reached for his hat. "Thank you." "Wait," Clara said. "I still don't know your name." He paused near the doorway. "Elias Kane." Clara felt the room become strangely still. Martha's warning returned instantly. The most feared gunslinger in the territory. She studied the man before her, expecting to find something matching the stories she had heard only hours earlier. Instead, she saw someone who had carried an injured child across the prairie before allowing his own wound to be cleaned. Elias noticed the brief change in her expression but said nothing. He placed a few coins on the table beside Tommy's bed. "For the boy's care." Clara pushed them back toward him. "He'll need medicine over the next few days. Save your money for that." Elias quietly slid the coins back into his pocket. "Good night, Doctor." Before she could ask another question, he stepped outside and disappeared into the darkness. The following morning, the story had already spread through Red Creek. Clara had barely unlocked the clinic when Martha hurried inside. "Please tell me it isn't true." Clara looked up from arranging bottles on a shelf. "What have you heard?" "That Elias Kane was here last night," Clara answered honestly. "He brought me an injured boy." Martha stared at her in disbelief. "You let him inside?" "He needed help." "He's dangerous." Clara remained calm. "The child was bleeding. That's what mattered." Before Martha could respond, two miners entered with curious expressions, followed by an older rancher. Each repeated a different version of the same warning. Elias Kane could not be trusted. He always had a reason for everything. Clara listened respectfully, but found herself remembering the quiet determination with which he had insisted the wounded boy be treated before himself. Nothing about the encounter had matched the fearful descriptions filling the room now. Late that afternoon, Tommy's younger sister, Emma Collins, arrived, carrying a basket of fresh biscuits wrapped in a cloth. She smiled shyly as Clara invited her inside. "My brother wanted to thank you," she said. "He's already feeling better." Clara accepted the basket. "I'm glad." Emma hesitated before speaking again. "People are talking about Mr. Kane." Clara looked at the girl with gentle curiosity. Emma lowered her voice. "They keep saying he's terrible." She glanced toward the door to make sure no one else was listening. "But he's the one who always helps people when nobody's looking." Clara blinked in surprise. "What do you mean?" Emma offered only a small, knowing smile. "He always saves people." Before Clara could ask another question, the girl thanked her once more and hurried back into the busy street, leaving the young doctor alone with words that fit none of the stories Red Creek insisted were true. The following morning, Clara changed Tommy's bandage and was pleased to see the wound healing cleanly. The boy smiled more easily now, though his shoulder remained stiff. Emma sat beside him, reading quietly from a worn storybook until Clara finished her examination. "Keep the bandage dry," Clara reminded Tommy, "and no climbing fences for a while." Tommy grinned sheepishly. "I'll try." Emma thanked Clara before helping her brother outside to wait for a neighbor's wagon. As they reached the doorway, Emma hesitated and turned back. "Can I ask you something, Doctor?" "Of course." "Do you believe everything people say about Mr. Kane?" Clara considered the question carefully. "I believe what I've seen so far." Emma smiled with visible relief. "Then maybe you'll understand someday." Clara invited the girl to sit for a few minutes while Tommy waited outside. Emma folded her hands in her lap. "Mr. Kane checks on us sometimes," she said quietly, "after our parents died. There were weeks when food just appeared." "You know it came from him." Emma nodded. "He always left before we opened the door, but once I saw him riding away, he asked me not to tell anyone." Clara listened without interrupting. Emma continued. "Last winter he chopped firewood for Mrs. Harper after she broke her leg. He fixed the Collins well before that. He even brought medicine when Tommy had a fever." "Why wouldn't he let anyone know?" Emma shrugged. "He said people deserve help, not attention." Clara thought about the calm man who had refused treatment until Tommy was safe. The picture Emma painted matched the man she had met, not the feared outlaw described by the town. Before leaving, Emma looked back once more. He doesn't want people to be afraid of him. He just doesn't try to stop them. After the children departed, Clara spent the afternoon seeing patients with ordinary frontier ailments, sprained wrists, persistent coughs, and a miner with a badly infected hand. Between appointments, she found herself thinking about Emma's words. They raised more questions than answers. Near sunset, Sheriff Owen Briggs stepped into the clinic. He was a broad-shouldered man with silver beginning to show beneath his hat and tired eyes that suggested years of difficult decisions. "Dr. Whitmore," he said politely. "Sheriff," he removed his hat. "Mind if we talk?" Clara motioned toward a chair. Briggs remained standing instead. "I've heard you've already met Elias Kane." "He brought me an injured boy." The sheriff nodded slowly. "That's what I was told." Clara waited. Briggs finally spoke again. "You're new here. I'd rather you hear this from me than from gossip." "I'm listening." "Kane has a dangerous reputation for a reason. Whether every story is true or not isn't the point. Trouble follows him." Clara folded her hands. "The man I met spent an hour making sure a child survived before thinking about himself." Briggs did not argue. "I'm glad the boy lived." "Then why warn me?" The sheriff looked toward the window before answering. "Because some people carry storms with them, even when they don't mean to." Clara sensed there was more behind the statement, but Briggs seemed unwilling to continue. "Just be careful," he said. "That's all I'm asking." After he left, Clara remained thoughtful. The sheriff had spoken with concern rather than hatred, yet he had carefully avoided giving specific reasons. It was another conversation filled with missing pieces. That evening, after the clinic closed, Clara remembered the patient files Samuel Reed had left behind. She unlocked the cabinet beneath her desk and carefully sorted through the records until she found the thin folder marked with Elias Kane's name. Inside were only a few treatment notes written over several years. None described gunshot wounds from bar fights or reckless duels. Instead, they recorded broken ribs, deep cuts, bruised shoulders, and injuries consistent with shielding someone from falling debris or heavy impacts. One note caught her attention. Patient refused to identify those protected during incident. Another simply read, "Returned only after ensuring others were safe." Clara frowned. The pattern repeated through every visit. Samuel had never written anything suggesting cruelty or aggression. Each record described a man who arrived injured only after someone else had been cared for. Tucked inside the back cover was a loose sheet in Samuel's handwriting. It contained only one sentence: "Judge the man by what he risks, not by what people fear." Clara read it twice before carefully returning it to the folder. She wondered how many times Samuel had treated Elias and why he had chosen to preserve these particular notes. As she slid the file back into the cabinet, she realized the old doctor had known far more about the gunslinger than he had ever admitted. The clinic grew quiet as darkness settled over Red Creek. Clara locked the front door, extinguished all but one lamp, and reopened the cabinet. This time she reached deeper behind the medical records until her fingers touched another worn envelope hidden beneath the files. It bore Samuel Reed's handwriting and a single name on the front: Elias Kane. Clara carried the worn envelope to her desk and carefully unfolded its contents beneath the glow of the oil lamp. Inside, she found several loose medical notes written in Samuel Reed's precise handwriting. They covered years of treatment, each page documenting injuries Elias Kane had suffered. Clara expected to find records of bullet wounds from reckless gunfights, but the pattern surprised her. Deep bruises across the back, broken ribs, a fractured shoulder, cuts along his arms. Again and again, Samuel had noted nearly identical observations. Injury consistent with shielding another person. Patient struck from behind. Refused to identify those involved. One entry made Clara stop reading altogether. Wound across the back indicates patient turned away from danger rather than toward it. She slowly read the sentence again. Someone protecting another person often received injuries to the back instead of the chest. That simple medical fact could not be argued away by rumor. Samuel had also written brief personal observations in the margins. Patient insists others be treated first. Accepted no payment from the family. Left before sunrise. There were no dramatic explanations, only quiet facts recorded by a physician with no reason to lie in his own private files. Clara leaned back in her chair, trying to reconcile those notes with the terrifying stories repeated throughout Red Creek. They did not fit together. She carefully returned the papers to the envelope and locked them inside her desk before finally going to bed. The following morning, the clinic quickly filled with patients. Clara spent hours stitching a ranch hand's injured hand, examining a pregnant woman, and treating 2 children suffering from fever. By late afternoon, she finally stepped outside for fresh air. As she crossed the boardwalk toward the general store, she noticed a familiar horse tied near the watering trough. The dark bay gelding stood quietly, its saddle worn from years of travel. A few moments later, Elias Kane emerged from the mercantile, carrying a small sack of supplies. Several townspeople immediately stepped aside to give him room. Some lowered their eyes. Others watched him cautiously until he passed. Elias acknowledged no one. He simply walked toward his horse as though accustomed to the distance people placed between themselves and him. Before he could mount, Clara found herself calling his name. "Mr. Kane?" He turned, appearing mildly surprised to see her approaching. "Doctor, how is your arm?" "Healing." She smiled faintly. "That's the shortest medical report I've ever received." A hint of amusement touched the corner of his mouth. "You did good work." "Thank you." An awkward silence settled between them before Clara spoke again. "Tommy is recovering well." Elias nodded with quiet relief. "Good. Emma says he's been asking when he'll be able to help around the house again." "Tell him not to hurry." Clara studied the man standing before her. He seemed uncomfortable receiving gratitude, but perfectly willing to discuss the well-being of others. "Emma also told me you've helped her family more than once." His expression became guarded. "Children say many things." She seemed sincere. Elias adjusted the saddle strap without meeting her eyes. They're good kids. You care about them. He looked toward the street rather than answering directly. Someone should. Clara sensed he was deliberately ending the conversation before it became personal. People here don't seem to know that side of you. Elias rested one hand on the saddle horn. People believe what makes sense to them. Doesn't it bother you? He considered the question for a long moment. Not as much as you'd think. Before Clara could ask another, he reached into his saddlebag, searching for something. As he moved, his coat shifted open just enough for a small metal object tucked inside an inner pocket to catch the afternoon sunlight. Clara recognized the distinct shape immediately. It was an old five-pointed lawman's badge, worn with age but unmistakable. For an instant she could clearly make out the engraved star before Elias noticed where she was looking. His hand immediately closed his coat, hiding the badge from view. Their eyes met in complete silence. "Where did you get that?" Clara asked softly. Elias's calm expression changed almost imperceptibly. Without answering, he fastened the last buckle on his saddle, mounted his horse, and gathered the reins. "Take care of yourself, Doctor," he said quietly. Then he turned the horse toward the open road and rode away before Clara could ask another question, leaving her staring after him and wondering why the most feared gunslinger in Red Creek carried the badge of a lawman. For the next several days, Clara found herself thinking about the badge far more often than she intended. A man could own an old revolver, a worn saddle, or even a military coat without much explanation. But a lawman's badge was different. It represented duty, authority, and trust. None of it fit the reputation Red Creek had built around Elias Kane. Yet the medical notes Samuel Reed had left behind, Emma's quiet stories, and Elias's own actions all pointed in the same direction. Clara decided that if she wanted the truth, she would stop listening to rumors and begin paying attention to what she could actually see. The opportunity came sooner than expected. One afternoon, a ranch hand rushed into the clinic carrying his young daughter, who had fallen from a horse and cut her forehead badly. Clara immediately cleaned the wound and carefully stitched the cut while reassuring the frightened child. As she finished tying the final bandage, she glanced through the front window and noticed Elias standing across the street beside his horse. He had apparently been passing through town, but remained where he was until the little girl walked out of the clinic smiling instead of crying. Only after seeing her safe did he quietly mount his horse and continue on his way without speaking to anyone. Clara watched him disappear down the street before returning to her work. It was another small moment that no one else seemed to notice. Later that week, she encountered him again while gathering medical herbs along the creek outside town. Elias was repairing a broken fence that bordered land belonging to an elderly widow. There was no one else nearby. He worked steadily, replacing damaged rails and reinforcing old posts. Clara approached with a polite smile. "I didn't know this was your property." Elias shook his hand. "It isn't." "Then why are you fixing the fence?" "Because she can't." He drove another nail into place and stood back to inspect the repair. Clara recognized the widow's name from Samuel's patient records. Arthritis had left the woman unable to perform heavy labor. "Does she know you're doing this?" Elias picked up another board. "She'll know the fence is standing." Clara smiled despite herself. "You really don't like being thanked? It changes nothing." They worked in comfortable silence for several minutes before Clara handed him a hammer lying in the grass. "Thank you," he said. "You're welcome." It was the longest conversation they had shared without discussing injuries or illness. As the afternoon sun lowered across the valley, Clara realized she no longer felt the caution everyone else expected her to feel around him. Instead, she felt curious and unexpectedly at ease. When the repair was finished, Elias loaded his tools onto his horse. "You should head back before dark," he said. "The trail gets difficult after sunset." "Are you always looking after people?" she asked with a gentle smile. He gave a small shrug. "Old habits." Before Clara could ask what he meant, he tipped his hat and rode away. Word of their conversation spread through town far more quickly than Clara expected. The next morning, Martha Doyle entered the clinic carrying fresh bread, but wearing an expression of unmistakable concern. "People saw you talking with Kane yesterday." Clara accepted the loaf with a thankful smile. "We were repairing a fence," Martha sighed. "Doctor, folks are starting to wonder if you understand who that man is." "I'm trying to understand who he really is." Martha lowered her voice. "Be careful. Good intentions don't always end well out here." Similar comments followed throughout the day. A miner casually asked whether Elias had frightened her. A merchant suggested she avoid being seen with him again. Clara answered politely but refused to repeat opinions she could not verify. Every conversation reminded her how completely the town had accepted one version of the man without question. That evening, Sheriff Owen Briggs stopped by the clinic to deliver medical supplies ordered from a neighboring county. As he placed the crate on the floor, Clara decided it was time to ask directly. "Sheriff, may I ask you something?" "Go ahead." "I saw a badge inside Elias Kane's coat." Briggs froze almost imperceptibly before setting the crate down. "What kind of badge?" "A lawman's star." The sheriff remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he looked toward the closed door to make certain they were alone. "You really saw it?" Clara nodded. Briggs let out a slow breath. "Then I suppose there isn't much point pretending otherwise." Clara waited patiently. "Yes," he said at last. "That badge is real." "Then why does the most feared gunslinger in this territory carry a lawman's badge?" Briggs removed his hat and rubbed a hand across his forehead. "Because before people knew him as Elias Kane the gunslinger..." He stopped, choosing his words with obvious care. "There are parts of his past that very few people still remember." Clara searched his face. "Will you tell me?" The sheriff looked out the window toward the fading light before answering quietly. "Tomorrow. It's time you heard at least part of the truth." Sheriff Owen Briggs arrived at the clinic the following evening, just as Clara finished treating her last patient. He closed the front door behind him and removed his hat, his expression more thoughtful than usual. Clara poured 2 cups of coffee, sensing the conversation would not be brief. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Finally, Briggs rested his hands on the back of a chair. "I told you I'd explain what I could," he said quietly. "I intend to keep that promise." Clara nodded. "I'm listening." The sheriff looked toward the window before beginning. "Years ago, long before you came to Red Creek, Elias Kane wore that badge openly. He wasn't an outlaw then." Clara remained silent, allowing him to continue. "He served as a lawman, a good one." Those simple words alone challenged everything the town claimed to know. "Then what happened?" she asked. Briggs shook his head slowly. "That's where I have to be careful." He chose each sentence with obvious restraint. "There was violence, more than anyone wanted. People died." Clara waited for details, but none came. "Was Elias responsible?" Briggs answered with complete honesty. "He was there." "That's not the same thing." "No," Briggs admitted, "it isn't." He folded his arms. "I've seen men who enjoyed violence. Elias was never one of them." Clara thought of Samuel's medical notes, Emma's stories, and the quiet man who always placed others first. "If he was a lawman," she asked, "why does everyone call him a killer?" Briggs sighed. "Because that's the story that survived. And the truth? The whole truth isn't mine to tell. Clara could hear regret in his voice. The sheriff was not hiding information to protect himself. He was guarding something he believed still mattered. You trust him, she said. Briggs looked directly at her. I'd trust him with my life. The answer came without hesitation, before Clara could ask another question. Briggs stood and picked up his hat. Just remember this, Doctor, sometimes the hardest burden a person carries is one they never argue about. After he left, Clara sat alone for several minutes, replaying every word Briggs had confirmed only part of what she suspected. Elias had once served the law, yet some terrible event had transformed his reputation forever. The missing pieces seemed more important than ever. 2 days later, Clara found Elias sitting outside the livery stable while she returned from a house call. His horse stood nearby, drinking from a trough. He appeared to be repairing a worn leather rein with careful hands. Clara approached slowly. Good afternoon. Elias looked up and offered a small nod. Doctor, may I sit for a moment? He gestured toward the empty section of the bench. They watched people crossing the street, each occupied with ordinary business. Several townsfolk noticed the pair together and quickly looked away. Clara finally broke the silence. Sheriff Briggs told me you were once a lawman. Elias's hands stopped moving for the briefest moment before continuing with the repair. He shouldn't have said that. He didn't tell me much. There's a reason. Clara studied him. Why won't you tell me yourself? Elias tied off the leather strip and set the rein beside him. Because the past is finished. It doesn't seem finished to you. His expression remained calm, but his eyes carried a sadness she had not noticed before. Some things stay where they belong if you leave them alone. Clara spoke gently. I've treated enough patients to know that wounds don't heal simply because people refuse to look at them. A faint smile crossed his face. Doctors always believe that, don't you? He looked toward the distant hills. Some wounds aren't ours to reopen. Clara sensed she was standing at the edge of a story he desperately wanted to keep buried. She decided not to push further. Instead, she changed the subject, asking about his arm. It healed well, he answered. Thanks to you. She smiled. I'm glad. As she stood to leave, Elias spoke quietly. You should stop asking questions about me. Clara turned back. Why? Because the answers won't make your life easier. Truth usually doesn't. He gave a tired nod, but said nothing more. That evening, Clara returned to the clinic, unable to let the conversation go. If Elias truly wished to hide his past, why had he kept the badge at all? She remembered Samuel's files and searched through the cabinet once more, hoping she had overlooked something. Between 2 old account books, she discovered a folded newspaper clipping tucked inside one of Samuel's ledgers. The paper was yellow with age, and part of the headline had been torn away. Only a few sentences remained readable. The article referred to a deadly confrontation years earlier and described multiple deaths, identifying Elias Kane as the central figure. Yet, as Clara compared the article with everything she had learned, something immediately felt wrong. The brief report portrayed Elias as a ruthless gunman, but it mentioned no witnesses, no rescued victims, and no explanation for why the shooting had begun. It contradicted Samuel's notes, Emma's memories, and Sheriff Briggs's quiet confidence. Clara carefully folded the clipping and looked out the darkened clinic window. Somewhere beyond the town lights, the man everyone feared continued carrying a burden no one seemed willing to explain. And she realized the written record itself might be hiding as much as it revealed. The newspaper clipping stayed on Clara's desk long after the clinic had closed. She read it again by lamplight, searching for details that might explain the contradictions, but every sentence felt incomplete. It described gunfire, several dead men, and Elias Kane's name in bold print. Yet it offered no clear reason for the confrontation and mentioned no innocent people who might have been present. The more she compared it with Samuel Reed's notes and Sheriff Briggs's guarded words, the less convincing it became. Early the next morning, Clara visited Sheriff Briggs at his office. She laid the faded clipping on his desk without speaking. He glanced at it once and quietly folded it closed. "Where did you find this?" he asked. "Among Samuel's papers." Briggs sighed. "I was afraid he'd kept that. It's missing half the story." "Less than half." Clara met his eyes. "Then help me find the rest." The sheriff remained silent for several moments before finally reaching for an old county map hanging on the wall. He pointed toward a small ranch several miles outside Red Creek. "A woman named Margaret Lawson lives here. She's one of the few people still alive who was there that day." Clara looked at the map. "Will she speak to me?" "I don't know," Briggs admitted. "She's spent years trying to forget." "Should I tell her you sent me?" He shook his head. "No. Just tell her you're looking for the truth." That afternoon, Clara saddled a borrowed horse and followed the narrow trail leading through rolling grassland toward the isolated ranch. The modest farmhouse stood beneath several cottonwood trees, surrounded by weathered fencing and a small vegetable garden. An elderly woman stepped onto the porch before Clara even reached the gate, as though she had been expecting a visitor. "Mrs. Lawson?" Clara called. "Yes." "My name is Dr. Clara Whitmore." The older woman smiled politely but cautiously. "What brings a doctor all the way out here?" Clara hesitated before answering honestly. "I'm trying to understand who Elias Kane really is." The woman's expression changed immediately. She looked toward the empty fields before quietly saying, "You'd better come inside." They sat at a small kitchen table where sunlight streamed through lace curtains. Margaret poured tea with slightly trembling hands. For several minutes, she asked Clara about the clinic, Samuel Reed, and life in Red Creek, avoiding the subject that had brought the young doctor there. Finally, Clara placed the newspaper clipping on the table. "This doesn't feel true," she said softly. Margaret stared at the paper for a long time before pushing it aside. "No," she whispered. "It never was." Clara waited patiently. The older woman's eyes filled with distant memories. "People remember the gunfire," she said. "They forgot what came before it." "What happened?" Margaret clasped her hands together. "My husband, my little boy, and several other families were traveling together that day. We were stopped by armed men." Clara's heart tightened. "They took hostages." Margaret slowly nodded. "They threatened to kill us if anyone resisted." She paused to steady her voice. "Then Elias arrived." Clara listened without interrupting. "He didn't come looking for a fight," Margaret continued. "He came because someone had managed to escape and find help. He tried to talk first. I remember that clearly. He gave them every chance to surrender." Tears welled in her eyes. "They answered with gunfire." Clara understood now why Briggs had refused to speak carelessly about the past. Margaret looked toward the window. "When the shooting started, Elias kept moving in front of us, pushing people behind wagons, telling us to stay down." My little boy froze in the open. Her voice broke. "Elias ran straight through the bullets to reach him." Clara thought immediately of Samuel's repeated medical notes describing injuries across Elias's back. They suddenly made perfect sense. "Your son survived?" Margaret smiled through tears. "He's alive today because Elias carried him to safety." Silence settled over the room. After a long moment, Clara asked the question that had troubled her from the beginning. "If that's true, why has everyone believed something so different?" Margaret lowered her eyes. "The men who escaped spread another story before the truth could travel. By the time people heard the facts, they preferred the legend." Why didn't Elias defend himself? The older woman slowly stood and walked to a small wooden cabinet. From inside, she removed a carefully wrapped envelope tied with faded blue ribbon. Returning to the table, she placed it gently in front of Clara. "I asked him that once," she said. "He only smiled and said some truths were safer kept quiet." Margaret rested her hand on the envelope. "Afterward, someone sent me this. I've kept it ever since." Clara looked at the aged paper without opening it. "What is it?" Margaret's eyes softened. "A letter that explains more than I ever could." Clara accepted the envelope with both hands, careful not to damage the brittle paper. Margaret Lawson nodded gently. "Go ahead," she said. "It was meant to be read by someone willing to look beyond the rumors." Clara untied the faded ribbon and unfolded the letter. The signature at the bottom immediately caught her attention before she even began reading. It had been written by a senior U.S. Marshal several years earlier. She slowly read the contents aloud. The letter praised Deputy U.S. Marshal Elias Kane for extraordinary courage during the hostage rescue. It stated that he had repeatedly placed himself between armed outlaws and innocent families, refusing to abandon civilians despite overwhelming danger. It also commended his restraint, noting that he had attempted negotiation before firing a single shot and had acted only after every peaceful option had failed. Clara paused for a moment, overwhelmed by the contrast between those official words and the stories that had followed Elias ever since. Margaret quietly wiped away a tear. "That's the man I remember." Clara continued reading. The final paragraphs explained that the rescued families deserved privacy and protection while remaining members of the outlaw gang were still at large. Publicly releasing complete reports could expose witnesses to retaliation. The marshal praised Elias for accepting that burden without complaint, placing the safety of others above recognition for his own actions. When Clara reached the final line, her voice softened. "History may never know your sacrifice, but those whose lives you saved already do." She carefully folded the letter. Neither woman spoke for several moments. At last, Clara looked up. "Why was this never made public?" Margaret sighed. "The people who knew the truth wanted to protect their children. Others were afraid." Before long, the lies spread farther than the facts. Clara thought of the newspaper clipping hidden in Samuel Reed's files. A brief, incomplete report had become the story everyone repeated, while the official letter had remained forgotten inside a private home. "Thank you for trusting me with this," she said. Margaret smiled warmly. "Someone has to carry the truth now." Clara returned to Red Creek before sunset and walked directly to Sheriff Briggs's office. Without a word, she placed the folded letter on his desk. Briggs recognized the signature almost immediately. His expression changed as he slowly read each page. When he finished, he removed his glasses and looked out the window for a long moment. "I wondered if this still existed," he said quietly. "You knew about it?" Clara asked. He nodded. "I knew it had been written. I never knew where it ended up." Clara sat across from him. "Everything Margaret told me matches Samuel's records and everything I've seen with my own eyes." Briggs carefully refolded the letter. "Because it's the truth." "Then why let people believe otherwise all these years?" The sheriff rested his elbows on the desk. "After the rescue, there were still dangerous men connected to that gang. Families who testified could have become targets. Elias insisted the official records remain sealed until the danger had passed. By then, the rumors had already taken root." Clara lowered her eyes. "He sacrificed his own name." Briggs gave a slow nod. "Without hesitation." "Did anyone ever try to correct the story later?" "A few did," Briggs answered. "Most people preferred the legend. It was simpler than the truth." Clara looked at the letter once more. "Someone also made sure the official record disappeared from public view." Briggs frowned thoughtfully. whether it happened through neglect or intention. Too much was left buried. A single newspaper article survived, while everything explaining it faded into forgotten files and private drawers. Clara understood then that silence could be just as powerful as lies. She carefully placed the letter back into its envelope. People deserve to know. Briggs looked at her with quiet agreement, but offered no immediate answer. As Clara stepped out of the sheriff's office, she noticed Emma Collins hurrying toward her. The young girl looked unusually anxious. "Doctor," she said, catching her breath, "I was looking for you." "What's wrong?" Emma hesitated. "Mr. Kane came by our house this afternoon." Clara smiled faintly. "Was Tommy feeling all right?" "Tommy's fine." Emma looked down at the ground. "Mr. Kane said goodbye." Clara's heart tightened. "Goodbye?" Emma nodded. "He told us to take care of each other. He said it was time for him to leave Red Creek." Without another word, Clara turned toward the edge of town where the road disappeared into the western hills. Realizing that the man she had finally begun to understand was preparing to walk away before anyone else learned the truth, Clara left the sheriff's office at once and hurried toward the stable at the edge of town where Elias usually kept his horse. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the empty street, and a cool breeze carried dust through Red Creek. When she reached the stable, she found him tightening the final strap on his saddle. A small bedroll and a pair of saddlebags were already secured behind the seat. He looked up as she approached, but did not appear surprised. "Emma told you," he said quietly. Clara nodded, trying to catch her breath. "You're leaving?" "It's time." "Because of me?" Elias rested one hand on the saddle horn. "Because staying has never made life easier for anyone." Clara stepped closer. "That's not true." He offered a faint, tired smile. "People sleep better believing I'm passing through than believing I'm staying." Clara reached into her satchel and carefully removed the faded envelope Margaret Lawson had given her. "I know about the letter." Elias's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Margaret still had it. She trusted me with it." He lowered his eyes for a moment. "She shouldn't have." "Why?" Clara asked gently. "Because it changes nothing. It changes everything." She held up the envelope. "It proves who you really are." Elias slowly shook his head. "It proves what happened once. It doesn't erase years of fear." Clara looked at him with quiet determination. "Sheriff Briggs confirmed it. Samuel Reed's records confirmed it. Margaret confirmed it. Every person I've spoken to has shown me the same man. The one who risks himself for everyone else." Elias remained silent. After a long pause, he spoke softly. "The people who survived that day deserved quiet lives. Some of the outlaws escaped. If the official reports had become public then, families with children would have been hunted for giving testimony. Keeping my name stained was a small price to pay compared with what they could have lost." Clara understood now why he had never defended himself. "So you let the whole territory believe you were a murderer?" "It seemed simpler for everyone except you." He smiled sadly. "I've had worse burdens." Clara searched his face, seeing not the feared gunslinger from the stories, but the patient, gentle man she had slowly come to know. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" she asked. Elias gave a small shake of his head. "I see the man who carried an injured boy to my clinic before asking for help himself. The man who repaired fences for widows, brought food to children, and accepted being hated if it meant innocent families stayed safe." He looked away toward the open prairie. "You see too much." "No," Clara whispered. "For the first time, I think I finally see enough." The silence between them felt different now. No longer uncertain, but honest. Clara took another step forward. I don't want you to leave. Elias closed his eyes briefly. You barely know me. I know the man you've chosen to be every single day, even when no one was watching. He looked back at her, and for the first time, the careful distance he always carried seemed to falter. Clara. Hearing her name spoken so softly made her heart ache. I care about you, she said, more than I expected, more than I ever planned. Elias said nothing for several seconds. When he finally answered, his voice was almost a whisper. Don't. Why? Because you deserve a life untouched by my past. Clara smiled sadly. You still believe your reputation is stronger than the truth? Sometimes it is. Not this time. He looked at the envelope in her hands. Even if the town hears everything, there will always be people who remember only the rumors. Perhaps, Clara replied, but that doesn't mean they should never hear the truth. Elias rested both hands on the saddle, as though uncertain whether to mount the horse or remain where he stood. I've spent years accepting who people think I am, he admitted. After a while, it becomes easier than asking them to believe something different. Clara gently touched his hand. You never asked me to believe anything. You simply lived with kindness. The truth found me on its own. He looked at her with quiet gratitude. The sadness in his eyes softened by something warmer. Thank you, he said, for seeing me. Before either of them could speak again, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed across the stable yard. Sheriff Briggs walked toward them, carrying his hat beneath one arm. He stopped a few feet away and looked from Clara to Elias. I've made a decision, he said. Elias immediately understood. Owen. The sheriff raised a hand. It's time. He glanced at the envelope Clara still held. Tomorrow morning I'm calling a meeting in the town square. Everyone who wants to come will hear the official record, the marshal's letter, and the truth that should have been told years ago. Elias remained silent, uncertainty written across his face. Briggs stepped closer. You've carried this burden long enough, old friend. Let us carry it with you now. By mid-morning, nearly the entire town had gathered in the square outside the sheriff's office. Miners, ranchers, merchants, and families stood together beneath the clear Colorado sky, speaking in quiet voices as they wondered why Sheriff Owen Briggs had called such an unusual meeting. Clara stood near the front, holding the carefully preserved envelope Margaret Lawson had entrusted to her. Beside her, Elias Kane remained calm despite the countless eyes fixed upon him. He had spent years enduring suspicion without complaint, yet standing openly before the people who feared him seemed more difficult than facing any gunfight. Briggs stepped onto the wooden porch and removed his hat. The conversations slowly faded until the square became silent. Thank you for coming, he began. Today isn't about reopening old wounds. It's about correcting an old wrong. He looked toward Elias before continuing. Many of you have spent years believing one story about this man. I helped allow that silence to continue, and for that I share responsibility. Murmurs spread through the crowd. Martha Doyle folded her arms, uncertain where the sheriff was leading. Briggs accepted the envelope from Clara and carefully unfolded the letter written years earlier by the senior U.S. Marshal. He read every word aloud. The official commendation described Deputy U.S. Marshal Elias Kane's courage during the hostage rescue, his repeated attempts to negotiate peacefully, and his decision to shield innocent families despite overwhelming danger. It explained that he had fired only after every peaceful option had failed, and that his actions had saved numerous lives as Briggs continued reading. The crowd grew completely still. Several people lowered their heads. Others glanced toward Elias with expressions that no longer held fear, but disbelief. When the final sentence echoed across the square, Briggs folded the letter with great care. This document has remained hidden for years because witnesses needed protection from surviving members of the outlaw gang. Elias accepted the loss of his own reputation so those families could live without fear of retaliation. Clara looked toward the faces gathered before them. The silence now carried a different weight. Margaret Lawson slowly stepped forward from the crowd. Though age had bent her shoulders, her voice remained steady. "I was there," she said, "my husband, my little boy. And I would have died that day if Elias hadn't stood between us and those guns." She turned toward the townspeople. "Everything the sheriff read is true." More voices followed. A rancher admitted that years earlier, Elias had quietly rescued his brother during a blizzard. Another woman recalled receiving food when her family had nothing left after a harsh winter. Emma Collins stepped forward next. Without hesitation, she crossed the square and wrapped both arms around Elias. "I knew they were wrong," she said softly. Elias gently rested a hand on her shoulder, emotion briefly overcoming the quiet composure he had always maintained. Martha Doyle slowly approached next. She looked directly at Elias, her eyes filled with regret. "I spent years repeating stories I never questioned," she said. "I'm sorry." Elias gave a small nod. "Thank you." There was no anger in his voice, only quiet acceptance. Clara thought about Samuel Reed then, the old doctor's careful records, hidden files, and gentle advice had guided her toward the truth long after his retirement, though Samuel was no longer there to witness the moment. His decision to preserve those documents had become the first thread leading back to justice. Without his quiet faith that one day someone would ask the right questions, the truth might have remained buried forever. As the gathering slowly dispersed, people who had once crossed the street to avoid Elias now stopped to shake his hand. No dramatic celebration followed. Trust damaged over many years could not be rebuilt in a single morning. But something important had changed. The fear that had defined his place in Red Creek no longer stood unchallenged. Days turned into weeks, and Elias chose not to leave after all. Instead, he remained in the town where he had spent years living in the shadows. Clara continued caring for patients at the clinic, and before long they began discussing an idea that reflected everything they both believed. With help from Sheriff Briggs, Martha, Emma, and many of the townspeople, they expanded the small clinic into a place that also offered temporary shelter for orphaned children, injured travelers, and families facing difficult times. Elias repaired walls, built beds, chopped firewood, and quietly completed whatever work needed doing. He never sought attention. He simply continued living exactly as he always had. The difference was that now people noticed. Emma often helped Clara organize medical supplies after school, proudly telling new arrivals that Mr. Kane could fix almost anything. Martha regularly brought fresh meals to the shelter, laughing that she intended to make up for years of believing foolish gossip. Sheriff Briggs stopped by every week, never failing to remind Elias that Red Creek was a better town because he had stayed. One peaceful evening, Clara and Elias stood together on the porch, watching children play in the yard beside the clinic. The setting sun painted the mountains with deep shades of gold and crimson. Clara smiled as she looked at him. "Do you know what made me fall in love with you?" Elias glanced at her with quiet curiosity. "I thought it might have been the fact that I finally stopped arguing with your medical advice." She laughed softly. "No." She reached for his hand. "It wasn't because you were the fastest gunslinger or because people finally learned who you had been. It was because every time no one was watching, you chose kindness anyway." Elias looked toward the children running through the grass. "I never expected anyone to notice." "I did." He squeezed her hand gently. Then I was luckier than I realized. Before going inside, Elias unbuckled the revolver from his belt. For years, it had been a symbol of the life he had carried and the burden he had accepted. He stepped into the clinic and carefully hung it on a wooden peg beside the old lawman's badge that Clara had framed after the truth came to light. Neither item would be forgotten, but neither would define him anymore. When he returned to the porch, Clara slipped her hand into his once more. Together they looked across the quiet town that had finally learned to see beyond fear. As the last light of day settled over Red Creek, they walked forward side by side, not as a doctor and the town's most feared gunslinger, but as two people who had discovered that the strongest force in any frontier was never a weapon or a reputation. It was the courage to believe the truth about another human being, even when the whole world had chosen an easier story.